in the next one that I'll do will be sort of looking at the components of the 4 love tests that are intrinsic to getting into the Sacred Yoni. And we'll talk about them a little bit tonight, but at another time we'll have some other talks about that as I get the opportunity to come back. And yeah, and hopefully you'll relish what I have to share, keep what's worthwhile, and let the rest of it go. Any questions as I go along, feel free to ask. Okay, so don't leave it till the end. I'll be happy to answer questions. If you're starting to take over the talk, I'll leave it to the end to answer the questions. But I certainly invite you to ask questions as we're going along. Cherubim is a Etruscan necropoli just north of Rome. And I had the opportunity to spend a day walking through, and it's just the most amazing place where you've got all these streets and all of these buildings that are made out of stone, and the stone that most of them are made of in this region is tough. And it's sort of like a sandstone, but lighter, and probably easier to work with in terms of doing shape. But as you can see, these buildings are over 2,000 years old, so they've been there for a long time. What this is the Cherubim is a necropoli. It's a city of the dead. So literally every one of these buildings is a tomb. And it's actually created in the shape and form of their homes. The only difference was that the Etruscans, who were pre-Romans, built their homes from timber. And so we actually didn't have much evidence of what their actual homes were, other than the fact that it was fully replicated in these stone replicas in these tombs. And so you walk along the street, and instead of going up into a house, you walk down into the house. And so as much as they have these roofs, what happens is you walk down and everything is found underground. And they have different rooms. There's bedrooms and like a lounge room, and there's windows, and there's tiles on the roof. Well, they're not tiles, they're carved tough. And so you end up with this whole house being structured underground. So you've got these seats, and then you go into back rooms, and this is a roof here. These would have all been painted, so they would have been originally painted in whatever colours that they would have had access to at that time. And if any of you are into this sort of thing, if you have a close look, there's lots of orbs in these photos. And in fact, you'll see just these little circles that are sort of sitting in around these rooms. And in fact, I think the next one, let me tell you, you can see lots of orbs in that area there. And then the next one, there's even more orbs in this one here. I just thought I'd throw in all the orb photos for you. Some people claim that that's just pure digital anomalies in terms of the way in which dust is being picked up by light, and others would say that it's energetic, that our digital cameras are able to pick up energies. And so you can take whatever you want to. Because there is such an interest in orbs, I just thought you guys might be interested. So that's just a photograph into one of the buildings that we were looking at. And that's what, when I came back to look at the photo, there were hundreds of orbs in there, which is just really quite spectacular if you're into orbs. Yeah. Now, the reason I wanted to talk about this was because not every single tomb had these structures in it, but these structures were found at the back of several of the ones that I went through. And these were passageways that were either carved into the stone or were made out of bricks, big bricks, and created out of bricks. And they were literally passageways at the back of the house that would go into another room at the back. I would have to walk in nearly sideways or at an angle because of how narrow these were. And so I have spent years trying to, I've even written to some academics and trying to get somebody to tell me what these were about. Nobody's ventured to say anything about it to me, and it could be that I'm just missing the wrong academia in terms of finding out the information. But I would like to suggest to you that in fact, these are sacred yonis. These represent a birth passage, and that certain members of families were entitled to have their ashes, and all of the deceased were cremated and were in urns, and some urns would be in the front of the house and a few urns would be in the back of the house, and it was like there was sort of some sort of privilege of being able to go into the back of the house. But I would suggest, and as you can see, some of these were up to 15 foot long. So they've gone to a lot of trouble to carve this into the stone in order to create these passageways in these rooms. They had some significance in terms of what they were about. And I would like to suggest to you that in fact, what we were dealing with was what was depicted in the world card, which is the wreath that we see in the world card, and which is in fact a sacred yoni. Okay, this is, and this is going to have more significance as we go through the discussion tonight. What this alludes to is the whole idea that the concept of us that the Old Testament talks about in Genesis, when God said that Adam and Eve have become one of us. You know, I just love the fact that we've moved into an age where we now use collective pronouns to describe people instead of him or her. It's they or us. God was doing it right back in the Garden of Eden, according to Genesis. He said, now they've become one of us, which is this idea of the collective idea of gender. It's more than alluding to this idea of just masculine. And this was certainly evidenced by the fact that the card that represents the kingdom of heaven has a sacred yoni front and center, which would allude to the idea that the sacred feminine is really important in terms of the spiritual journey and understanding, and really understanding what the sacred feminine is and what the significant to us is in terms of that. And so we're going to sort of play with that a little bit tonight and give you some more understanding. This mandorla shape, as they would call it in Italy, almond, mandorla is almond, was called the Vesicus Pisces. And then the four figures on the outside were called tetramorphs. Okay, the bull, the lion, the eagle, and the angel were referred to as the tetramorphs. I love the time that I've spent in Europe going around to cathedrals, and you see the tetramorphs everywhere, both ancient symbolism of it and more modern symbolism. And of course, the tetramorphs were ascribed Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John eventually as the four Gospels. And so you will often see the bull, the lion, the eagle, and the angel, the man, with a textbook of some kind. So it'll be the Gospel that they're holding. And so the Catholic Church was making it really clear that this was actually not about anything pre-Christian, which is called, that's where they borrowed it from. The tetramorphs existed long before Christianity. How do we know that? Ezekiel in the Old Testament describes cherubim as a figure that had four faces. And what were the faces? The face of a bull, a lion, an eagle, and a man, or an angel. So we know that the tetramorph existed long before Christianity got hold of it and turned it into Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so this is an ancient symbol and has a very, very significant part of the understanding of, they have a very important role as it relates to the Sacred Yoni. And we'll be talking about that as we go along. Here's some of the ones that I came across when I lived in Italy, in some of the museums. You just see these. Once again, here we have the Vesicus Pisces and the tetramorphs. This is at the front of the cathedral in Siena, and here you see the tetramorphs. Here they are with manuscripts depicted in this one here. These ones here don't have manuscripts, but it was kind of interesting. Everywhere you went, you would see these symbols. Now, this was really kind of interesting because if you really understood their significance and what they represented, you literally had tools for being mindful of what they represented at every turn as you went about your life. In other words, they became mindfulness tools to remind you to align yourself with what they represented. And that was quite significant. You know, we need that. And so, you know, I have around my neck a symbol, and it's got the cross, which represents those four elements. And then right in the middle of mine is a Vesicus Pisces. So if I'm at a place where I'm sort of losing my inner peace place, I'll often just pick this up and take a moment to hold it just to remind me of the things that I choose to have as being what I value most. I walked the Camino de Santiago in 2011, and I took a bit of an exit, went on an old part of the journey up into Yuso and Suso. There were two monasteries that were in caves. One was in a cave, one was in a church, but it's where the origins of the Spanish language was supposed to be. And I came across this beautiful pendant, and I've taken some liberty and had a whole lot of them made. So any of the people who go through my mentoring program and become mentors, when they're certified, they get this beautiful pendant, and the pendant is a cross, and it's got the bull, the lion, the eagle, and the angel on each of the four arms. And in the center is a sacred yoni with Christ in the center of the yoni. And each one of our mentors, when they sort of are certified as a mentor, have that as a symbol of their certification, in terms of, because it's about a way of life, not just a process of education. The Louvre is one of my favorite places to go. Anybody had the opportunity to go to the Louvre in Paris? Couldn't you just get lost there? You know, go back day after day. And anyway, I came across the Russian art area and antiquity art. And this is a 16th century painting. They don't know who it was done by, but just the most amazing piece of art. But here's this is kind of different, because here we see the Sacred Yoni, the Vesicus Pisces, and down here we have the tetramorph. And so instead of them being superimposed, they're now starting to suggest a progression. And so what we have here is Christ representing, he's on the mercy seat, which is this part of where God resides. And so this is reminding us that the Christ has an association with the divine, but he's still in his human form at this point, and that everything that he's about is about bringing these four elements into balance: the bull, the lion, the eagle, and the angel. And so we're going to explore that in a minute. But then what this suggests is that once they're in balance, then you have the right to enter the Sacred Yoni. And so this even has what could be perceivably hymen that is showing in it, which is this idea of the Sacred Virgin, and the idea, and here we have Christ entering the Sacred Yoni in order to return to the kingdom of heaven. In other words, it isn't enough to have developed Christ consciousness to enter the kingdom of heaven, you also have to pass through the Sacred Yoni of the mother in order to return to heaven. Okay?
As in a rebirth.
As another birth. Absolutely. Okay? And so it's another birth. This is being born of the water. Born of the spirit. Okay, and we'll talk about that a little bit, hopefully a little bit later on. And so once again, we see this being portrayed. Now, for those of you, what did the Catholic Church do with the Divine Mother or the Sacred Feminine? What did they end up calling it?
The Virgin.
No, the New Jerusalem. And do you know what became the symbol of the Divine Mother in the Catholic Church? Cathedrals, Notre Dame. The cathedrals were the Sacred Mother, the Divine Mother, and they had their rose windows, which were all symbol. Joseph Campbell goes into this in a lot of detail in his writings about the fact that the cathedrals literally became the symbol of the Divine Feminine. Don't hear that being taught very much these days, but in fact, that's what was going on. And that's why they were often referred to, more than one were given that reference of Notre Dame, which is the mother. Okay, so we've got this process then where we go through recalibrating the bull, the lion, the eagle, and the angel. We're going to talk about them hopefully in a minute, and then we get into, and then once we've done that, and that's a test. In fact, that's called the test of the cherubim. Okay, if you recall. I might leave that, and because I've forgotten what I've got coming up in the slides. So if I don't talk about it later, I won't talk about it now. We'll get it anyway. You then pass through the Sacred Yoni and you come back into the presence of God. Okay. The tetramorph is a precursor to entering the vesicus Pisces, giving access to heaven. And I talked about, so there's the tetramorph, there's the Sacred Yoni, the vesicus Pisces, and I talked about the cherubim. Ezekiel called the tetramorph cherubim and describes it as having the face of a man, the face of a lion, the face of an ox, and the face of an eagle. This is the one of the windows in the Siena Cathedral. So I had to take a photo of this around the corner. I couldn't get it. But if you look real closely here, you'll see the vesicus Pisces with the mother in there, Mary. And then you see down here you can see the lion, the angel, the bull, and the eagle would have been on the other corners. And so once again, that's about 1372. Around the late 1300s that particular window was crafted in the Siena Cathedral. So, you know, this is an ongoing theme. You don't always see Mary in the middle though. You'll often see Jesus in the center, but this one depicts Mary in there. The tetramorph is the key for opening the gate to the rose garden. This is Joseph Campbell. When Mary was worshipped as a goddess in her palaces of the queens of heaven or Notre Dame, she was at different times given a variety of rose-scented titles. The rose, rose bush, rose garland, rose garden, wreath of roses, mystic rose, queen of the most holy, rose garden. So the rose was the symbol of the Sacred Yoni. And to enter the rose garden, you had to have keys to unlock the door. And the tetramorph is the key to understanding the key necessary, one of the keys necessary for opening that door. So I am going back there. So let's start at the beginning in the garden, biblically speaking. So these are friezes off the Cathedral in Orvieto in Italy. And so here we have Adam and Eve. This is Eve being created out of Adam's rib, and they turn up in the Garden of Eden. And they are living life until in such a way that they're in the presence of God. And of course, the serpent tempts Eve, and Adam and Eve eat the forbidden fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And now they experience being different to God. How do we know that?
They realised they were naked.
They realised they were naked. Okay, and this is my version of making a ancient biblical scripture into modern English. So Adam and Eve became as one of us. This is God speaking. To know good and evil. Now that's really important. It's not having the knowledge of good and evil that's the problem, because obviously God has the knowledge of good and evil. So duality, consciousness, isn't an issue. And now the last thing we want is for them to pick the fruit of the tree of life and eat and live forever in this state of differentiation. So in other words, here's what the difference was. God had eaten of the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, but was in a place of undifferentiation. So all God understood was oneness, in spite of having eaten of the fruit of knowledge of good and evil. Adam and Eve ate of the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, and now we're in a consciousness of differentiation. And differentiation isn't sustainable, eternally speaking. So in other words, Adam and Eve couldn't stay in the garden, not because they had knowledge of good and evil, but because they perceived that they were differentiated. They were no longer in a state of oneness. Does that make sense? So they're expelled from the garden. So he drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the garden cherubim and a flaming sword, which turned every way to keep the way of the tree of life. In other words, to stop people who shouldn't be eating the fruit of everlasting life from eating the fruit. But there was a cherubim and a flaming sword there. Now, wouldn't you think that knowing all about the cherubim and the flaming sword would be important? If this is the thing that God put at the eastern gate to stop Adam and Eve coming back and to partaking of the tree of life, you would think we would want to know what that was about. Now, you may have heard me say this before, but I like asking this question. How many people here, in all the years that you've attended church sessions and things like that, had your ministers talk about cherubim and the flaming sword and what they represented for entering back into the kingdom of heaven? Never. Never. It is never discussed. Does it have anything to do with Christ? Absolutely. But it's never been discussed in terms of, if that was, that was important. We were told this is what you've got to be able to get beyond in order to go back in there.
But they used it in the context of guarding it.
Well, they were gatekeepers.
Mm.
So to some extent, they are guarding it. But yes, you're right. And of course, what we know is that whatever their role is, it's about finding out whether the person who's turned up to want to enter has become what? In terms of their state of consciousness, whole or undifferentiated. In other words, these are tests for wholeness, because that's the only thing that can go back into the presence of God with the knowledge of good and evil, is somebody who's been able to reintegrate wholeness and are in a state of undifferentiation, which means that they would then have permission to enter back into the presence of God. So now it makes sense when we hear the scriptures where Jesus talks about saying, you've got to become one as I and the Father are one. In other words, he fully understood that what that was about. He was saying that you've got to come to this state of oneness. And of course, the whole thing is, well, how do we do that? And that's what the Cathar built into these images, was what was required for being able to qualify to come back to that place of oneness. That's the beauty of what's in these images in terms of what they represent and what they teach. Incredibly profound. So differentiated consciousness. The fool, who is Adam and Eve, have left the east gate of the rose garden of Eden, which is now way behind them. If you have a look down beneath the magician's legs, I always wondered, there's all sorts of different versions of this, but I always wondered, why did they always have this thing between his legs? It's the Sacred Yoni. It's way back there. In other words, consciousness has removed itself from wholeness that much that it's now on the horizon. We're now in a state of total differentiation. Having eaten the fruit of duality, they now experience differentiation through identifying with having a body, physical, that experiences personal thoughts, mental, feelings, emotional, and desires, spiritual. So now, all of a sudden, Adam and Eve are experiencing life through 4 filters that didn't exist before. In fact, these 4 filters is what creates differentiation: physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. Those things, and that's what Adam and Eve started to experience in the garden. They started to have thoughts of their own, which was different to God. How was that evidenced? They made the decision to eat the fruit. They were naked, so they now had a physical sense that they were different. They wanted to hide themselves. They had fear. Up until this point, there was no fear. And of course, the desire was to choose to act independently of God, their motivation, which was inspired by the serpent. In other words, it was fuel. So they were going through these 4 aspects of consciousness that became the catalyst for differentiation. It's what separates us, in fact. is the notion that there is physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. That would then suggest that the absence of those four things are necessary for wholeness. The magician, and who this guy is an illusionist, reminding the fool that what they are about to experience, that is, being human, is an illusion. None of it is real. In fact, the closest thing that you could probably subscribe to is the idea that this is in fact a dream. And if you think about your own dreams, when you wake up, sometimes you're in a sweat, sometimes you're aroused, sometimes you're fearful, sometimes you're laughing, and it was all real while you're in the dream. And when you woke up, you went, oh, it was just a dream. And the magician is saying to you, you're going to wake up one day and go, oh, it was all a dream. On his table are his symbols of the illusion. He has a pentacle, a coin, which represents wealth. He has a wand, which is a symbol of power. On his desk, he has cups, which are symbols of love. And he has swords or daggers, which are symbols of victory or success or achievement. And what the magician is saying, because for those of you who are into the tarot, the pentacles, wands, swords, and cups are the four suits that make up the minor arcana. And they're all about the illusion. They represent all the dimensions of what we experience in the world of illusion. And so when you have tarot readings, a lot of what's represented in a tarot reading is about the world of illusion. People are asking about love. They're asking about success, all the choices around the illusionary things in the world, primarily. When you think of, if any of you are familiar with people who do tarot readings, so much of it is about satisfying people's questions about the world of illusion. The four primary aspects of the illusion manifest as pentacles, which we just talked about, etc., etc. Okay. So, this is how I ended up creating the